I am Martin Chen, and I built a 6-foot cedar privacy fence around my backyard last spring. It was beautiful, professionally installed, and completely within my property lines. The HOA sent me a violation notice 3 days after completion, demanding I tear it down for breaking architectural guidelines. Here is what they did not know. I had obtained approval from the previous architectural committee before they were replaced. I had documentation proving the new committee had no authority to retroactively revoke permits already granted. I could have shown them the paperwork immediately, but I did not. Instead, I let them escalate. I let them threaten fines. I let them schedule a hearing. And then I let the entire community watch as their overreach became so extreme that 73% of residents voted to recall the entire board. If you enjoy stories about communities standing up to petty tyranny, hit subscribe. You will not want to miss how this unfolds. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped into my mailbox in a bright orange envelope that screamed official business. I pulled it out while still standing at the curb, reading the bold text across the top. Notice of architectural violation, unauthorized fence installation. According to the notice, my fence violated Section 4.2 of the Community Covenants, which required all exterior modifications to receive written approval from the Architectural Review Committee before construction. The fence had to be removed within 21 days, or I would face fines of $100 per day until compliance was achieved. The notice was signed by Richard Brennan, Architectural Committee Chairman, with a signature that looked practiced and important. I walked back to my house and stood in the backyard, looking at the fence. It was exactly what I had wanted. 6 feet of solid cedar planks, professionally stained with decorative post caps that caught the afternoon light. The installers had done excellent work. The posts were perfectly plumb, the boards evenly spaced, the gates hung with precision. It had cost me $8,000 and transformed my yard from a space where neighbors could watch my every move into actual private property. But now someone named Richard Brennan was telling me it had to come down. I went inside and pulled out the file folder I had kept from the fence project. Inside was everything I needed. The original application I had submitted to the Architectural Committee 9 months earlier. The approval letter I had received 6 weeks after that, signed by Margaret Torres, committee chairwoman at the time. Letter explicitly stated that a 6-foot cedar privacy fence was approved for installation at my property address, subject to standard setback requirements and professional installation. I had followed every requirement. The fence was set back the required 5 feet from my property lines. It had been installed by a licensed contractor. I had even submitted photographs of the completed work to the HOA office, though no one had responded. The problem was not that I had violated the rules. The problem was that the rules had changed after I received approval. Margaret Torres had resigned from the Architectural Committee 8 months ago after a dispute with the new HOA president. The entire committee had been replaced with people loyal to the president, a man named Douglas Kemp who had been elected on a platform of strict enforcement and maintaining property values. Richard Brennan was one of Kemp's appointees, installed as committee chairman 3 months ago. And apparently Brennan had decided that previously approved fences were now violations. I could have called Richard Brennan immediately. I could have sent him copies of my approval letter and watched his violation notice collapse. But I had heard stories about Douglas Kemp and his new board. They did not admit mistakes. They doubled down. They found new violations to justify their original positions. If I showed them the approval letter now, they would claim it was invalid for some technical reason. They would say the previous committee had exceeded its authority. They would invent a new interpretation of the covenants that made my fence retroactively non-compliant, and then they would spend months making my life miserable until I either gave up or moved away. There was another option. I could let them escalate. I could let Richard Brennan and Douglas Kemp commit themselves publicly to the position that my fence was unauthorized. I could let them schedule hearings and threaten fines and create a paper trail of their overreach. And then, at exactly the right moment, I could produce the approval letter and watch their credibility collapse in front of the entire community. It was risky. It would require patience, but it might be the only way to stop them from doing this to someone else. I made my decision. I put the approval letter back in the folder and filed it away. Then I drafted a response to the violation notice. The response was brief, polite, and completely non-committal. I acknowledged receipt of the notice and requested a hearing before the Architectural Committee to discuss the matter. I did not mention the approval letter. I did not argue that the fence was compliant. I simply requested a hearing, which was my right under the covenants. The hearing would force them to state their case publicly. It would create a record, and it would give me time to prepare for what came next. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I began documenting everything. I took photographs of my fence from every angle, showing the professional installation and the setback distances. I photographed my neighbors' fences, many of which were identical to mine. Some had been installed before the new committee took over. Some had been installed after. None of them had received violation notices. The selective enforcement was obvious, and I documented all of it. I also started attending HOA board meetings. I had never been to one before. I had moved into this community 2 years earlier and paid my dues without paying attention to the politics. That was a mistake I was now correcting. The meetings were held on the first Thursday of each month in the community center, a small building near the subdivision entrance. The first meeting I attended had maybe 15 residents in the audience. Most looked tired or resigned, people who had been fighting the board for months without success. Douglas Kemp ran the meetings with an iron grip. He sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members who rarely spoke unless he prompted them. He moved through the agenda quickly, dismissing questions from residents with practiced efficiency. When someone complained about a pothole that had not been repaired, Kemp said it was not in the budget. When someone asked why the playground equipment had been removed, Kemp said it was a liability issue. When someone questioned a fine they had received, Kemp said enforcement decisions were final and not subject to debate. The message was clear. The board made decisions. Residents obeyed them. I did not speak at that first meeting. I just watched and listened. I watched how Kemp controlled the conversation. I listened to how he dismissed concerns without actually addressing them. And I noticed something important. The other board members were uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats when Kemp cut off residents mid-sentence. They avoided eye contact when he announced new enforcement actions. They were not leaders. They were enablers, too afraid or too compliant to challenge him. After the meeting, I approached one of the board members in the parking lot. Her name was Linda Morrison, and she had been on the board for 4 years, longer than anyone else. I introduced myself and mentioned that I had received a violation notice about my fence. She looked uncomfortable immediately. "I am sorry," she said. "The architectural committee handles those matters. I do not get involved." I asked if she knew that my fence was identical to at least 6 other fences in the neighborhood. She glanced away. "You should bring that up at your hearing." Then she got in her car and drove away before I could ask anything else. The hearing arrived on a Thursday evening. I walked into the community center carrying a folder with my documentation, though I had no intention of using it yet. Richard Brennan sat at the head of a table with 2 other committee members, both of whom I recognized from board meetings as Kemp loyalists. About a dozen residents sat in the audience, apparently drawn by word that someone was actually challenging an enforcement action. Brennan called the hearing to order and read the violation notice aloud. Then he looked at me and asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I kept my response simple. I explained that I had hired a licensed contractor to install the fence. I confirmed that it met all setback requirements. I noted that multiple other properties in the community had identical fences, and then I asked a question. "Can you show me which specific provision of the architectural guidelines my fence violates?" Brennan frowned. He opened a binder and flipped through several pages before finding what he wanted. Section 4.2 requires all exterior modifications to receive written approval before installation. You did not obtain approval. Therefore, your fence is in violation. I asked if the committee had records showing I had not applied for approval. Brennan's frown deepened. "We have no record of any application from your address." I asked if it was possible that an application might have been approved before the current committee took office. Brennan exchanged glances with the other committee members. "Previous approvals are not relevant. This committee is responsible for current enforcement. If you cannot produce written approval from this committee, the fence is unauthorized." There it was, the statement I needed. Brennan had just declared that previous approvals did not matter. He had committed the committee to a position that only their approvals counted. When I eventually produced Margaret Torr's approval letter, this statement would destroy his credibility, but I was not ready to produce it yet. Instead, I asked another question. "If I apply for approval now, will the committee consider it?" Brennan shook his head. "You cannot apply for retroactive approval of a structure that already exists. The fence must be removed first. Then you may apply to build a new one." I let that sink in. "So you are requiring me to spend $8,000 to remove a fence and then spend another $8,000 to build an identical fence just so the paperwork goes through the current committee." Brennan's expression did not change. "Those are the rules, Mr. Chen." The hearing concluded with the committee upholding the violation. I had 18 days remaining to remove the fence, after which fines would begin accumulating at $100 per day. Brennan handed me a written decision and told me I could appeal to the full board if I wished. I told him I would consider it. As I left the community center, 3 residents approached me. They introduced themselves and shared their own stories. One had been fined for parking a work van in his driveway overnight. Another had been cited for planting flowers that were not on the approved landscaping list. The third had been threatened with legal action for painting his front door a shade of blue that was 2% different from the approved color palette. All 3 had tried to fight their violations. All 3 had eventually given up and paid the fines or made the changes. They told me I was wasting my time. The board never backed down. Kemp never admitted mistakes. The best thing I could do was remove the fence and move on. I thanked them for their advice. Then I went home and began preparing for the appeal. The appeal hearing was scheduled for the next board meeting, 4 weeks away. That gave me time to do something I should have done from the beginning. I started talking to my neighbors, not just the people on my street, but residents throughout the community. I knocked on doors. I attended the community yard sale. I showed up at the pool on weekends. And I asked a simple question. Has the HOA ever done something to you that felt unfair? The stories poured out. A woman who had been fined for having her trash cans visible from the street, even though she had brought them in within the required time frame. A man who had been cited for an oil stain on his driveway that he had tried repeatedly to remove. A family who had been threatened with a lien because they were 3 days late paying a fine they did not know they owed. The pattern was consistent. The board under Kemp's leadership had turned enforcement into a weapon. They were not maintaining standards. They were generating revenue and asserting control. I also discovered something else. The community covenants included a provision allowing residents to petition for a recall election. If 25% of homeowners signed a petition, the board would be required to hold a special election within 60 days. No one had ever attempted it. The process seemed too difficult, too time-consuming. But as I talked to more residents, I realized the anger was there. People were furious. They just needed someone to organize them. I started drafting a petition, but I did not circulate it yet. I needed one more thing. I needed the board to overreach so badly that even the residents who normally stayed silent would be willing to act. And I was betting that my fence appeal would give them exactly that opportunity. The board meeting was packed. Word had spread that someone was appealing an architectural violation, and at least 40 residents showed up to watch. I sat in the front row with my folder, waiting for my turn on the agenda. Douglas Kemp worked through the routine business first, then called my appeal. He asked Richard Brennan to summarize the committee's decision. Brennan did so efficiently, repeating the same arguments from the hearing. No approval on file. Retroactive approval not permitted. Fence must be removed. Kemp asked if I wanted to present my case. I stood and walked to the front of the room. I did not open my folder. Instead, I addressed the room directly. I explained that I had followed every rule. I had hired a professional contractor. I had met all setback requirements. I had built a fence identical to others in the community. And then I asked the board a question. If my fence is a violation, why have identical fences at other addresses not received violation notices? Kemp's expression hardened. This hearing is about your property, Mr. Chen, not other properties. I pressed the point. But selective enforcement violates the covenants. If you are going to cite me for having a fence, you need to cite everyone with the same fence. Otherwise, you are not enforcing standards. You are targeting individuals. The room went silent. Several residents nodded. Kemp leaned forward. The board has discretion in enforcement matters. We are not required to pursue every violation simultaneously. Your fence is the one under review tonight. Do you have any evidence that it was approved by the architectural committee? This was the moment. I could open my folder and produce the approval letter. I could end this right now, but I looked at the faces in the audience. I saw anger, frustration, and fear. These people needed more than just my fence to be saved. They needed the board to be stopped, so I made a choice. I told Kemp I had submitted an application months ago and never received a response. He asked if I had proof. I said the HOA office should have records. He said they had checked and found nothing. I suggested that records might have been lost during the committee transition. He said that was my problem, not the board's. The board voted 4-1 to uphold the violation. Linda Morrison was the only no vote, though she did not explain why. Kemp announced that I had 14 days to remove the fence or face fines of $100 per day. He also added a new penalty. If the fence was not removed within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property. The meeting adjourned. As residents filed out, several approached me with sympathy. A few offered to help me find a contractor for the removal. One elderly man shook his head and said, "You should have just taken it down. Now they are going to make an example of you." I went home and finalized the recall petition. The language was simple. We, the undersigned homeowners, have lost confidence in the current board of directors and request a special election to recall all sitting board members. The petition cited a pattern of selective enforcement, lack of transparency, and abuse of authority. I printed 200 copies. The next morning, I began collecting signatures. I started with the residents I had already spoken to, the ones who had shared their stories of unfair fines and arbitrary enforcement. Most signed immediately. Then I expanded to neighbors I had not met before. I explained what was happening with my fence. I showed them the violation notice and the board's decision. I explained that this was not just about one fence. It was about a board that had forgotten it was supposed to serve the community, not rule it. The signatures came quickly. Within a week, I had 60. Within 2 weeks, I had 120. The community had 310 homes, which meant I needed 78 signatures to meet the 25% threshold. But I did not stop at 78. I kept going. I wanted overwhelming support. I wanted the board to see that this was not a small group of malcontents. This was the community rejecting their leadership. By the time I submitted the petition, I had 187 signatures. More than 60% of the community. The HOA's management company confirmed receipt and scheduled the recall election for 6 weeks later. Under the covenants, the current board would remain in place until the election, but they could not take any major enforcement actions during that time. My fence was safe, at least temporarily. Douglas Kemp did not take the petition quietly. At the next board meeting, he spent 20 minutes attacking it. He claimed the signatures had been obtained through misrepresentation. He said I had lied to residents about the board's actions. He called the recall an attempt by a single disgruntled homeowner to overturn legitimate enforcement. He urged residents to reject the recall and support the board's efforts to maintain property values, but his speech backfired. The room was full again, and this time residents were not silent. They stood up and shared their own stories. The man with the oil stain. Woman with the trash cans. The family threatened with a lien. One by one, they described a board that had become obsessed with control and indifferent to fairness. Linda Morrison resigned from the board that night. She stood up during the meeting and said she could not continue to support actions she believed were wrong. She apologized to me specifically and said she should have spoken up sooner. Then she walked out. Her resignation left the board with only 4 members, the minimum required to conduct business. Kemp tried to appoint a replacement immediately, but residents shouted him down. The meeting ended in chaos. The recall election was held on a Saturday in the community center. Turnout was massive. More than 200 residents voted, nearly 65% of the community. The results were not close. The recall passed with 73% support. Douglas Kemp and the 3 remaining board members were removed from office immediately. A new election for replacement board members was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I did not run. I had no interest in being on the board. But I supported a slate of candidates who promised transparency, fair enforcement, and an end to the culture of fear that had taken over the community. All 5 of them won. The new board's first meeting was different. They invited residents to speak. They answered questions directly, and they announced a comprehensive review of all enforcement actions from the past 2 years. My fence was the first case they addressed. I finally opened my folder and presented the approval letter from Margaret Torres. The board reviewed it, confirmed its validity, and rescinded the violation notice. They also issued a formal apology and reimbursed me for the costs I had incurred responding to the violation. But they did not stop there. They reviewed every other enforcement action from Kemp's tenure and found dozens of cases where residents had been cited for violations that were either inconsistent with the covenants or selectively enforced. They rescinded fines totaling over $40,000. They apologized to families who had been driven out of the community, and they implemented new procedures requiring all enforcement actions to be reviewed by an independent attorney before notices were sent. Richard Brennan resigned from the architectural committee. Douglas Kemp moved out of the community 6 months later. The culture began to change slowly, but it changed. Residents started attending meetings again. People asked questions without fear of retaliation. The board became a service organization instead of an enforcement regime. My fence still stands. Every time I look at it, I remember what it cost to keep it there. Not the $8,000 I paid the contractor, the patience to let the board overreach, the risk of letting them escalate, the work of organizing a community that had given up hope. Some people ask if I regret not showing the approval letter sooner. The answer is no. If I had produced it at the first hearing, Brennan would have found a technicality to dismiss it. Kemp would have remained in power. The enforcement would have continued. The only way to stop them was to let them go so far that the community had no choice but to act. That fence became a symbol, not of defiance, but of what happens when people decide they have had enough. 187 signatures, 73% of the vote, a recall that removed an entire board. All because I built a fence and refused to tear it down. Always document everything. Always know your rights, and never assume that authority means someone is right, because sometimes the people in power are just waiting for someone to show the community what they really are.